Welcome, folks, as you come into this webinar. We're actually going to start off right off the top with a poll that has two questions. One is, tell us where you're from, what your location is, and also tell us about your organization. What kind of organization are you connected with? And that will give us a sense of everybody who's on board. So, welcome to this third in our winter series of learning spaces. For those of you participating for the first time, our title, Leading Beyond the Blizzard, will make sense in a few moments. This learning space, this particular webinar is titled Lament More, Celebrate More. My name is David Koop, and I direct the Urban and Community Development Program for master's students at Wycliffe College at the University of Toronto. And our thanks to Wycliffe College for hosting this webinar and this series. I see a good number of results coming in. This is great. Thanks very much. Keep them coming in as you sign in. So there is, of course, the question of how best to acknowledge the land and its Indigenous peoples when we are on a Zoom that incorporates so many traditional lands. At least in terms of Wycliffe College and the University of Toronto, in a world without pandemic, we would normally express gratitude for the opportunity to work on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. So we just encourage you, wherever you are, to be grateful for the land that you are on and its original inhabitants and the many Indigenous people we work with and live with today on these same lands. I also want to take a second to express gratitude to the partners we have in this series. Thanks to Tim Day and the people at waybase.com. Check them out. Thanks to the EFC, the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, to CCRDA, the Canadian Christian Relief and Development Association, and again, also to Wycliffe College here at the University of Toronto. But I especially want to shout out to Selah Foundation and acknowledge their generous funding and support for what we're doing here. So our agenda is structured in 3 or 4 parts. We have this introduction, and we'll have a moment of meditation that we can use to help get centered. After introductions of Andy and our panelists, we'll have Andy speak for about half an hour, which will probably take us to about 40 minutes past the top of the hour. Then our panelists in the second section will respond and engage Andy, almost kind of a coffee house fashion. We're not being too formal here today. And meanwhile, we will be collecting questions and comments from all of you via the chat and also via the Q&A tab that you see, or you should see on the bottom of your screen. So that final section of the webinar will be a chance for broader dialogue with everyone. So let me get us going here. I want to acknowledge the language that we have borrowed from Praxis Labs. On March 20th, which is almost a year ago, March 20th, 2020, near the beginning of the pandemic lockdown, Praxis Labs published an article called Leading Beyond the Blizzard, Why Every Organization is Now a Startup. And that article began an intense discussion amongst many Christian organizations. In the article, Andy Crouch, Kurt Kielhacker, and Dave Blanchard, I think they said several really important things. So I'm very pleased that one of the authors of that article is with us today. And I'm going to introduce the panelists. There are numerous ways. I'm sure many of you have come to know Andy Crouch over the years. Perhaps you've even met him in person back in the pre-COVID era. I don't know. Many of you remember we used to go to things like conferences. Many of you will know Andy as an author of several widely read books, like The Tech-Wise Family. I could think of Strong and Weak. There is one that goes back to earlier days called Culture Making that probably a lot of you have on your shelf. So I'm sure a number of you even recognize Andy from his, what was it, Andy, 10 years with Christianity Today. Um, he's also on the board of one of my old hangouts, Fuller Theological Seminary. Oh, and I like this. If you've ever listened to a hip hop song by the artist Lecrae called Nonfiction, look it up, listen to it, at 3:19, Andy figures clearly. So these days, Andy stays at home with his family in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, while he engages as partner for theology and culture at Praxis. And I'm really pleased also to introduce the two panelists that we'll be spending some time with today. First of all, Shayla Visser. I'm sure everybody on this call knows something about Alpha, which is an 11-week course that creates space for Jesus conversations among households, friends, neighbors, churches, even prisons, and many other contexts. So Shayla is not only the national director of Alpha Canada, I think she also serves as the global VP, is it, for Alpha International?
Yeah.
Shayla was, I think you also produced the core youth series and the regular series of films that Alpha depends on today. She's somebody that I think if you talk to folks about her, she's seen as a strategic leader, and she has this ability to bring people together. In fact, she's so recognized for that that she has been declared one of the top 100 most influential Christian women in Canada. I think I also saw that you've worked many years for Power to Change, which might explain a reference I saw about you leading conversations about Gen Z. Is that true? Gen Z, Gen Z? We have to be bilingual today, right?
Yeah.
And
I think I'm on
maybe an attachment to Arosha?
Yeah, I've been involved. I love Arasha, caring about creation, been a big fan for many years. And we have a passion globally, but in particular Canada, for Gen Z and what it means to reach that generation. So yeah, very, very kind and flattering introduction, David. Thank you. And so happy to be here. And a real honor to be with Ken and with Andy today. And particularly looking forward to the conversation with Andy following his presentation. So thank you.
If you don't mind, I'm going to keep saying Gen Z. It's kind of wired into
Oh, sorry. You know what? I just listened to too many Americans. Gen Z it is.
All right. So let me introduce Ken, who's our second panel member. Ken is senior pastor at 10th Church. And everybody has to know that because Ken has been there, I think, for almost 25 years. Is that true, Ken?
That's right. Yeah, come August, it'll be 25 years.
That is fabulous. You, of course, also know Ken from books that you've read by him. I would say that as a senior pastor, Ken Cutt's a rather interesting and unique figure. He would be described as a risk taker who draws on both the Eastern and Western sides of leadership philosophy. And his experience and practice have also made him a global thinker. And I think that's a feature which World Vision Canada recognized in naming him to their board. So before Ken entered full-time ministry, he was a private sector guy with the Sony Corporation in Tokyo. And you will, of course, know Ken for his award-winning bestseller, God in My Everything. And his most recent book, is that Survival Guide for the Soul?
Yeah.
Right. I think it's been listed at the top of the Word Guild list in 2019 as the book of the year. So go get one. So welcome to all three of you. It's fabulous to have you in the same digital space. But before Andy launches, I am going to turn the hosting over to Ken for a brief moment of meditation. Ken brings this beautiful gift of facilitation to the practice of spirituality. So we really just want to give a couple of moments for all of us to let go of it and breathe and pray together.
Great, thank you, David. So Shayla and I are here in Vancouver in different locations, but we're on the traditional unceded land of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coast Salish peoples. So let's enter into a time of prayer. Just close your eyes, and if you're seated, find a relaxed but alert position. And take a moment to breathe in deeply through your nose. And then exhale slowly. Breathe in deeply. And exhale slowly. No matter where you are, whether you're seated or standing, remind yourself that you are in the presence of a God who loves you and upholds the whole world in you. Continue to breathe in deeply through your nose and exhale slowly. Breathe in the breath, the ruach of God, and release whatever you need to let go of. Receive the Spirit afresh. Let go of any anxiety or frustration, sin or guilt. Continue to breathe in the breath of God. And exhale. Be still and know that God is God. Even in and especially in this pandemic. And with the psalmist, pray, search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me. And lead me in your everlasting way. If anything surfaces in your heart or spirit, whether it's a feeling of anxiety, or sadness, or joy or gratitude, just lift those up to God in prayer in the silence. Lord, we offer ourselves, what we carry, and who we are into your hands. And we commit this time to you. And may the words, especially of Andy's mouth, and the meditation of all of our hearts, be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen.
Oh, that was excellent, Ken. Thank you so much. I'm grateful for that. Andy, it's all yours.
Thank you. Ken, I would have set aside these 2 hours just to have you lead us for those few moments. That was a real gift. Thank you. I am really, really honored to be with you all today. Really grateful for David and Shayla and Ken, as well as Steve and Terry, who are behind the scenes, and many others who have made this possible. I'm grateful to be outside of Philadelphia in the United States on the historical land of the Lenape people, where I've lived for about 20 years. And I want to say how much I approached this topic of leading in the midst of the conditions of our pandemic and what may be coming. And I am going to try to speak a little bit about what may be coming. I'm very conscious of some limitations. And the one that is most painful is that I haven't been in Canada myself for more than a year. And it would have been the very rare 12-month period in the last 15 years of my life when I wasn't in your country many times. And so I feel keenly aware of what I don't know about the differences between the US experience of this set of challenges that we've all faced. In some ways, obviously a global reality, but it has played out quite differently in different places. And so you and my fellow panelists will have to do some of the contextualizing that normally I would at least try to be better informed than I turn out to be today. The other thing, of course, is that I don't know anything about the future. I know that God is good and holds the future. I know something about what is given us today to wrestle with and contend with. And that's really all I can speak about. So if you're coming looking for predictions, I have none. If you're coming looking for some way of navigating today as leaders, I hope I can offer something helpful. David mentioned this piece that my colleagues and I wrote in March of last year, Leading Beyond the Blizzard. And in that piece, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with the basic outline, we just had a sense that what was upon us was not a short-term acute event, but a very, very long-term, much longer-term kind of world-changing reality than most people were perhaps attending to at the time. And we coined this idea, not just a blizzard, not just winter, even kind of a long season of difficulty. A metaphor which works well in your context. I will say when we translated it into Spanish for some of our Latin American friends, it was a less familiar metaphor, but really something like the little ice ages that shaped life in Europe and in the Americas over periods of even centuries. None of us thinks this is going to be a centuries-long event, but we just invited leaders to realize that what we were entering into was a multi-year, so a very long duration, but also a climactic change, a change in the climate, not just a change in the weather, not just weather blowing through, but really a long-term reshaping of the world that we would all be leading in and that our organizations would have to function in. And there was a lot of persuading that we had to do in that piece, which a year later, almost a year later, I think feels less needed. But now I think the question is, what do we know today that we didn't know in March of 2020? And how might that shape how we lead? So I want to make two broad observations about what we are seeing. At least our organization Praxis gets to work to date with about 150 ventures, most of them startups in both the nonprofit and for-profit sectors, in every economic sector, in every sector of nonprofit work. And so we have this great privilege of accompanying people in all different kind of walks of leadership. And I'll just share a couple things that we are seeing 11 months after our piece Beyond the Blizzard. First thing to say is that compared to the worst case scenario of 11 months ago, in some really important ways, I think there's more opportunity than we imagined as we see how this pandemic is playing out. Not least, I was rereading it today just to remind myself of what we said and see if we got anything right. And, you know, we were thinking 18 months for the development of a vaccine, but in my state of Pennsylvania, already 6% of the population has received a vaccine, and we're behind many other states in the US. And so the speedy development of both more effective medical treatments and of preventative vaccines has been an amazing, amazing source of opportunity for the world in its public health dimensions. And economically, our contention was that the real long-term effects of this pandemic would actually be less medical and more economic, less about the epidemic, more about the economics. And we wondered, you may have heard these different terms, V-shaped recovery, very sharp drop, very quick return, U-shaped recovery. Then there are recessions, especially banking crises, that tend to have what's called L-shaped recoveries. It turns out, someone coined this phrase, I don't know who, that we've ended up, at least to date, with a K-shaped recovery. And this is very much a double-edged sword in that for some people and for some sectors of the economy, it really has been like a V. This certainly has been true for the global equity markets. It's just astonishing to me that we've seen a bull market in global equities in the midst of a huge challenge to our world's financial systems and real economies. And then there have been many areas of employment and business that actually have seen a huge quick bounce back from the initial pullback of the spring, the northern hemisphere spring of 2020. and are doing really well. And this could well include some organizations on this call that actually you may find that in fact, although there have been huge disruptions, that in some ways your work is going better than ever. I would actually say Praxis, my own organization, we've found ourselves very unexpectedly having had, by any measure we know how to deploy, the best year of our 10 years of existence. We're a young organization, but we've weathered the most significant crisis of our 10 years and had, objectively speaking, the best year. This is partly because major philanthropists who support our work and many of the nonprofit works that would be on this call, in general, their assets have not eroded the way that we might have imagined 11 months ago. They are still willing to give. They're still eager to support good work. And more broadly, there's still economic activity out there. And at the same time, there are other sectors and there are other people for whom this year will be the defining catastrophe of their lives and their communities' lives, from which they will never fully recover. There has not been a recovery. It's the other half of the K, right? And I know that some of you are feeling this and seeing this in your own work and in the communities that you serve. And I think that our tremendously difficult task as leaders is to keep both sides of this in mind. If things are going really well in and around you, if you work primarily with what we sometimes call white collar or knowledge workers who have been able to just pivot and work from home and benefit from Zoom, and you have contact with people who are able to continue to be generous and support what you do, praise God. And we need to, those of us on that side, and I am on that side, need to just be really attending to the devastation that's happening just around the corner, not really out of sight. On the other hand, if you feel completely battered by this, by the events of the last 11 months, I want to encourage you, there is opportunity in this crisis that is within your reach. And there are people who want to be generous, and there are ways to adapt. And we're seeing that play out in many different sectors. So there's more opportunity than I think we feared. At the same time, I would say there's more difficulty than we could easily have imagined. I woke up on the morning of March 15th, 2020 at 3 a.m., rolled over to my wife, Catherine, who was sleeping next to me, and woke her up. And I said, everyone's talking about 1918 because that was the beginning of the Spanish flu. But I don't think this is 1918. I think this is 1914. As you'll know, in June of 1914, the Archduke of the Prussian Empire, Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated in Sarajevo, a seemingly random act of political violence. But within just 3 months, Europe was at war, and a war that the combatants on both sides assumed would be extremely swift, would be a relatively uneventful interruption where a few things would be renegotiated. But in fact, the Great War changed everything. And by 1918, the conditions were ripe for a global pandemic, an influenza pandemic. But the whole landscape, certainly of Europe, had been completely reshaped. Its economies, its political geography, the Prussian Empire was no more. The German Empire, I guess I would say, was no more. The arrangements of Europe had been completely scrambled. And not incidentally, for those of us who are Christian leaders, it really was the end of Christendom. Christendom existed in 1914. And in a very real way, it did not exist in 1918, certainly not by the end of the 1920s. I think that we have discovered, as we've gone through this incredibly difficult year, that the difficulties we're facing, and in fact, what this historical moment will be remembered for, are not actually primarily medical. We will recover from this disease. It will mutate into more benign forms. We'll discover better treatments and better prevention. And in a couple of years, it will be a relatively benign background reality, the way that the flu is in the world. I think that's at least the most likely thing. We will not quickly recover from the fundamental reckoning with many global institutions. In the United States, this has taken the form most dramatically of are reckoning with the unfinished work of dismantling white supremacy. It's also taken the form, again, I can only really viscerally feel it in the US context, but of a tremendous crisis of confidence in our government and in the goodwill of our fellow citizens. And all of this has been unlocked in ways that are not going to be put back into a nice, neat box once we reach an 80% herd immunity threshold for the SARS-CoV-2 virus. It's 1914. Maybe now it's 1915. And I think we have to really reckon with how hard it is going to be to rebuild in the midst of a world that has discovered that many of its foundations that we thought were relatively secure have in fact been shaken. That's at least how it feels to me. So what can we do? What can we do as leaders? I want to share a number of, these are bullet points, which is to say, they're not really connected to one another. They're just like different angles on what I think we should be thinking about as leaders. And each of these, I think, represents difficulty and opportunity for us. The first thing I would say is be ready for the roaring 20s. Prepare for what at Praxis we've started calling normalcy snapback. Everybody wants normal back. Everybody wants 2019 back. Maybe not everybody, but a notable number of people want to return to what we remember of a time when we were more carefree, when we were more literally free to go about our lives and to hug our grandchildren and to gather for worship and do all the things that we had gotten pretty good at doing. And of course, after the Great War ended and the Spanish flu receded, this is exactly what happened in Europe and in North America. We had this incredible mania in the financial markets, in the business world, in the cultural world, a time of tremendous cultural flourishing in a way. And it was a time of great optimism, hope, and I think it was a little manic because under the surface, the sort of foundations of what the Western world, and obviously I'm speaking here just in the context of Western history by way of analogy, were actually very unstable. The settlement that had been imposed on the losing powers of the Great War was completely untenable, both economically and politically. It was going to lead to hyperinflation in the 1930s in Germany in particular, the rise of National Socialism in Germany. It was going to destabilize the economies of the victors as well. And so everyone around us in a couple months to years, depending on how exactly this plays out, is going to be roaring back. And it will be very tempting for us as leaders to think, whew, thank goodness we made it. We're done with that horrible COVID thing. And if we aren't careful, we will allow ourselves to be taken in by the illusion that some really fundamental things are not changing. I think this happened very profoundly and powerfully to the churches in what we now call the interwar era in Europe between the First and the Second Wars. And the churches really did not reckon with the way that Christian belief and practice had been undermined by the Great War. They did not attend to what real rebuilding would require, what a just rebuilding of their world would require. And they were not prepared for the 30s and for the further dislocations of the Second World War and the secularization of the second half of the 20th century. We can do this differently. We can be more sober while everything around us is going manic. Once we all get back in our restaurants and all of that, we can be looking with a further horizon and rebuilding at a deeper level. I think that's a big part of our charge as leaders in this time. A little more closer to this moment, I think it's very important for us to keep learning and keep changing. We've all done so much adapting. We're all so tired of all the adapting we've had to do. But this is an opportunity to keep learning, because the things that have been shaken loose in your church's work and your organization's work that have not gone well since COVID hit are an opportunity to ask, was it really working before? We're seeing, after a burst of attendance, a decline in attendance at virtual church services, for example. At least in the United States, this is happening. And a real disaffiliation from active worship. And this causes a lot of us who care about the worship life and the discipleship life of the church to ask, were we actually making disciples before? What did it mean that people were showing up at our services before? What kinds of Christians were we forming before this crucible appeared to test the metal of what we're making? We really need to keep pressing into what we're learning, both about what wasn't working, but also what does work. One thing we've learned at Praxis, much to our surprise, is there are actually ways to use this medium of Zoom in very formative ways in people's lives. Something I would have been very reluctant to admit maybe 18 months ago, is that actually Zoom, properly deployed, can be a real tool of discipleship and formation, although there are lots of ways to go wrong. And there are some things we've learned to do in our own organization and how we form Christian entrepreneurs, which is our task, that we're doing virtually that we will never go back to doing a different way. And we're continuing to pivot, not pivot so much as iterate and innovate as we learn what really helps people grow. And it turns out there are ways to do that. So don't give up on learning and changing, even though you and your team are tired of learning and changing. Building trust is the fundamental work of leadership. Trust is, I think, really the oxygen of all human life. It's the canopy, to change the metaphor, under which all human life, all flourishing human life takes place. It's the one thing we most need. And if you have it, there's a lot you can do, even if you have nothing else, even if you don't have money. I do often think of money as the oxygen of organizations, but of communities, trust is the oxygen. But the way that trust is built is shifting and needs to shift right now. I have thought for a long time, I wrote about this in my book, Culture Making, that the basic way that innovation and cultural creation happens is in circles of 3, 12, and 120. And I think this is actually kind of an empirical reality, that this is the way we organize ourselves as human beings to really do anything difficult, and creativity is always difficult. It starts with a very small circle, usually 3, sometimes 2 or 4, never 1, never 10, who have deep enough trust that they can really go out to the boundary of possibility and explore together. Those 3 mobilize a group of 12, who in then turn mobilize a group of, let's say, roughly 120. These numbers are approximate, but they are real. And they correlate to our neurology, the actual way our brains are designed and the way that we form ourselves in groups. There's this thing called Dunbar's number. The British anthropologist Robin Dunbar says we really can only keep track of about 150 people in our kinship group. And that's how human beings organize themselves. In the time of Zoom, these numbers shrink. I've really become convinced. And I want to focus actually on this middle number. You used to be able to work in groups of 12. If you think about, many of you probably have a boardroom or a meeting room where your governing board might meet or your key leadership team might meet. And very often it will have seats for roughly 12 people. And there's actually, I think, a deep human reason for that, which is that when we're together, if I'm in a room of about 12, I can actually mysteriously attend to the emotions, the presence, and some glimpses of the thoughts of about 10 to 12 other people around me simultaneously. And I'll notice if one of them is missing, leaves the room. I'll notice if one of them is upset. I'll notice if one of them is bored or disengaged. And I can kind of interact with a group that size. It gets much larger than that in person, and I start to lose track. Like, is Ken still here? And where is he? I can't really quite keep track, right? This number shrinks on Zoom to, I'd say, 4 or 5, maybe 6. The number of little rectangles you can pay attention to in that way that's required for deep human collaboration is not 12. If we had 12 faces on the screen, you'd be lost. And all of us have been in meetings like that. And we all know, we don't really know if that 4th person down in the 3rd row is actually really with us and what they're thinking, right? So we've got to shrink our creative circles. It's still going to be 3 at the core, But we've got to shrink the active working groups that we deploy to smaller groups. And this also is, our discipleship is going to have to shrink. A small group used to be maybe 9 or 10 people in a room. It's got to be 4 or 5 people now, because unless you are fully attended to and known, you're not going to develop the kind of trust that's needed for you to grow and for you to innovate change. And I imagine, I haven't thought this through, but I imagine that 120 also has to, in certain ways, shrink down. What's the material of trust? I think it's really important that we as leaders get out of the prediction business and into the promise business. One thing we clearly have learned in the last 11 months, and that I feel super acutely right now, I really can't predict. I don't even know how this vaccine is going to go in my own country or globally. We don't know what's going to happen with these variants of the virus that keep sprouting up. And I actually think we never needed prediction to do what we need to do as human beings. Prediction is based on assembling a set of patterns, often based on empirical study, and trying to extrapolate out into the future. And in very small controlled systems, it has a limited utility. But in the most important things of human life, all we can really do is make promises. I have been married, by the grace of God, for 26 years to my wife, Catherine. We were married on July 3rd, 1994. And I stood before Catherine in a service of the wedding and said to her, I, Andrew, on the basis of my past behavior and past romantic relationships and current trends in my character, can predict that I will love you faithfully, that I will never deviate from the vows I'm making. No, I didn't do anything like this at all. And Catherine certainly did not stand there thinking, I, Catherine, based on what I've been able to assess empirically of this young man, can certainly predict things are going to go well. No, what did I actually do? I used the traditional wedding vows. I, Andrew, take you, Catherine, to be my wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until we are parted by death. This is my solemn vow. It's really interesting that the vows that we make at our weddings actually build in unpredictability, better, worse, richer, poorer, sickness, health. All those things have happened in our marriage, but I could not predict any of those things. The only thing that's fully predictable is death, and it's the one thing we can truly predict. And instead of making predictions at these crucial moments of trust building and covenant making in our lives, we make promises. I think this calls for us to be really careful as leaders. What can I promise to those entrusted to me? I cannot promise employment for sure. How do I know 2 or 3 years from now that Praxis will be able to employ our current team? So I need to be very careful not to make promises I can't keep. But can I promise that whatever happens to the fortunes of our organization, we're going to treat every member of our team with dignity and give them full transparency and tell them everything we know as best as we can as we know it? I think we can make those kinds of promises. And there are other promises we can make that no future will abrogate. We need to build our trust, not on some account of what the future is going to be like, but some commitment of what we will be like, no matter what the future is like. One last thought. 2 things we do, I'm almost certain we need to be doing more of than we've been doing. Lamenting more and celebrating more. And I appreciate that Stephen and David chose this as the overall title for this. Your team is doing an amazing job. No matter the bumps and the complications, the fact that they are still showing up, managing to work with new demands, many of them working from home with puppies and children and aging parents and spouses and the needs of neighbors and all the things that suddenly impinge on our work lives and all the other challenges. It is amazing what we've been able to do these past 11 months. And part of our work as leaders is just to relentlessly celebrate this. Celebrate it more than you think you need to. Let me just give you one simple example, just that I experienced very viscerally. I'm doing a fair amount of speaking by Zoom right now. And you know what? One thing is that we almost always neglect. When we finish this seminar today, the host will hit the leave meeting for all participants button. And bang, I'll be gone. I'll be stuck here in Pennsylvania with a blank screen. And you know, back in the day when we finished something and it had gone reasonably well, and I'm always kind of astonished when it goes reasonably well, it would end and there would be these moments afterward when we just get to say, thank you. Hey, that was pretty good. You know, and even if it didn't go so well, we were able to patch it up and acknowledge it. There were these sort of debrief experiences. Sometimes in speaking, we call it the green room. I'm not a fan of green rooms per se, but the green room gave you a chance not just to prepare, but also to debrief and say thank you and say goodbye. If you're running events, build in a green room after your event for the people who have given themselves vulnerably to an audience they can't see, just like I can't see all of you, and have those moments just to celebrate, not to critique, not even to sort of unpack everything that could have been done better, but just to say, thank you, that was risky, that was hard, it was a gift, thank you for who you are, God bless you, and go. We probably need 1,000 different new techniques to celebrate what our teams are doing right now. And your team has lost a lot. They have lost a lot. There has been so much loss of life, of relationship, of joys. I don't have to enumerate it. You've lost a lot. I've lost a lot. And that means we need to lead our teams in lament, which I would just summarize, I think, as bringing our suffering into our relationship with God, bringing all our feelings about our suffering, our perplexity, our disappointment, our anger, our rage into our relationship with God. I could say more about this, but I'm at the end of the time, and I really think the most valuable thing is going to be the conversation. But I would just say, I'll share this slide if it's helpful to send out, but one of our venture partners at Praxis gave us this wonderful model of lament that many of the biblical laments include all or most of these different things: crying out, complaining, affirming trust, petitioning and making requests, making additional arguments to God, like, hey, have you thought about this, God? Why aren't you paying attention to this? Rage, completely appropriate to express our outrage and rage to God, with God, but also to convey our sense of assurance and our promise of obedience. Are we leading our people through this gamut of emotion because they are feeling the need to bring all these into their relationship with God, and they need to be helped to do that? That's one of the greatest gifts we can give one another as we lead one another through whatever is coming. So thank you all very much for your patience with the presentation, and now for the even better part as others join the conversation.
Andy, there's things that happen sometimes on Zoom, sometimes in classrooms, sometimes in public markets that are called public theology. And it feels like we're making some public theology today. When you've talked to us, I've heard social dialogue, I've heard political dialogue, I've heard economic, and I've heard theology woven throughout. And to me, and it's contextual. So to me, that's actually the making of public theology, which I think is a gift to everyone on this call. And it's a gift to organizations that are struggling to figure out, how do you be faith-based at a moment like this when you're lamenting things to God, and perhaps your organization even died, and you have to grieve that.
Yes.
You have to grieve that enormous loss of something that perhaps you and a group of others in that innovative circle invented.
Yes.
So thank you very much for this. Shayla and Ken, we don't have a formal way that I think we want to engage Andy, but I just want you to, well, don't open up and give them both barrels, but
if that's what's needed.
I can see you've really been engaging with this, and I'm really interested to hear your reflections, your questions, your comments, jump in.
Well, thank you, David. And I'll just say that I would love to hear Ken's reflections first. He is such a good thinker, and I always love hearing from him. I have more questions than reflections, but Ken, do you want to start off?
Sure. Yeah, Andy, first of all, thank you for sharing your wisdom. We won't have a green room. Eventually, someone's going to pull the cord on this meeting. So I hope that you feel affirmed. And I know you love Canada. So thank you for bringing your gifts here. Yeah, I appreciated what you had to say about Lament. Our team here at 10th, our staff team, I think it was back in November, had a special staff service where we named our losses.
Wow.
Because of the pandemic, wrote them down, losses that we were experiencing in our personal lives. One of my dear colleagues had unexpectedly lost his sister. She died, just a number of things. And it was, I think, powerfully healing. And,
Wow.
you know, as you also are aware, you know, from a neuroscience perspective, people like Dan Siegel, the professor of psychiatry at UCLA, point out that when you name a negative emotion, it tames it. He says, name it to tame it. And if we're in the presence of God and expressing honestly our hurt, our anger, our grief, not only are we consoled, knowing that God can be entrusted with these things, but on a neurological level,
Wow.
if we did an MR scan on your brain, it would show that the emotion center in your brain is actually being soothed and calmed. So that's
Wow.
very practical. And then on the other side of that, it opens the door, I think, to joy, gratitude, and
Yeah.
the appropriate kinds of celebration.
Yeah.
In your presentation, you also mentioned we need to be asking ourselves what is not working and what is working. And I think in a time of crisis for faith leaders, one of the things that we can test for ourselves is if, maybe this sounds too utilitarian, but is Christ working, in me, for us? And I think of a guy named Ramaz Atala, who's part of the Leighton Board mentoring community that you and I are both part of. And back in 2015, he's based out of Egypt. He's the head of the Bible Society there. He witnessed the killing of the was it 20 or so Egyptian martyrs on the beach.
Yeah.
And he walked into the office the next day feeling depressed and anticipating his staff would be really down. And one of his young colleagues was sort of excited and energized and said, growing up, I'd heard about the martyrs and how they were willing to lay down their life for their faith, but I never actually believed that could happen in our day, that someone would love Jesus so much that they would choose death over Jesus. And so I feel inspired and lifted up in my faith and, motivated to persevere. And, there have been times when I've woken up feeling the weight of people's job losses. A mother of adolescent girls in our community was on a ventilator and she was in a coma for 7 days and she, pulled through. But I felt the weight of leadership, but I've also sensed the presence of Christ to lift me and us through this time. And, the Apostle Paul says that we carry around in our body the death of Jesus so that his life might be revealed in our, clay jars. And so while it's really hard, I think we need to keep in mind, as you're saying, that it's also a great privilege to be serving in this time. So thank you for reminding us of that.
Wow. Thank you, Con. Wow.
I'll just say from my perspective, Andy, first of all, it was so helpful. I literally got on social media after we had a quick brief on Friday and I said, don't miss this. And I think everybody on it would agree. I'm glad I didn't miss this. I wonder when you talk about the K-shaped recovery, whether that's not just true of the economy and the church, but also us as individuals.
Wow.
Whether there's a K-shaped recovery within the leadership of the world, some recovering, there's people I know who are doing extraordinarily well in their leadership. They're feeling like this is the time where I've blossomed.
Right.
I've
Right.
been in a terrific place. And then there's those who have thought, and sadly, more people on the other side who have
Yeah.
had that whole, like, such extreme losses. So I was thinking about, is there K-shaped recovery in people, not just institutions and the economy,
Mm.
was something I was
Wow.
reflecting on.
Wow.
And then as I look to, you said something about 1914 versus 1918 and then the roaring 20s. I do have questions for you that I'd love to talk about. What did the church do well and what did it not do well, and what lessons could we learn?
Mm.
It was something I was thinking about, is what can we learn from history? History does repeat itself.
Right.
And what are the key learnings that we have?
Wow.
The third thing that I thought about in terms of the roaring 20s is, what was the church like then? What lessons did they learn that we could apply? And then what did it mean for them to lament and celebrate? Coming to your last point, I think I have found that celebration is more my natural tendency. And Ken, who knows me well, would say I'm that personality too. So I think some of us have pushed into celebration and not pushed into lament. Like, I love how Ken used the example of how they've done it as a church staff. We could probably improve on that with us, because I'm just more lean into all the wonderful things that have happened. But I'd love to know where you have seen that balanced well and not been one side versus the other, because I think we need to balance them out, both out. And so lament has been something I, as a leader, am leaning into. I will say lastly that your small groups, for us at Alpha, this was particular. I'm quite sure our staff leadership team that is on this call was thinking, what does that mean for us? But for anybody running
Right.
groups, the 3 to the 12 to the 120 becoming 3 to 5 to 12. And I look forward to hearing from you what this really means for us as the church. What, not just about your home groups could shrink, so 5 to have deep human collaboration, but what that really means for industry, what it means for us who aren't working in the church specifically. What will that look for our leadership teams, et cetera? So I have a lot of questions, but probably my biggest reflection was just, are there K-shaped people, not just K-shaped institutions? That was my big aha. Sorry, David, over to you.
So good.
We're going to let Andy ruminate just for a moment, because there's like 4 really powerful questions there.
Indeed.
We also have another poll that you can start working on while we're thinking about Shayla's questions. So the 2 questions are, once you get that code and can go there, what does your organization need to lament? And the second question is, what does your organization need to celebrate? So we're just going to create some words and phrases around that, just so we get a sense of perhaps the kinds of senses of loss and celebration that we're feeling here. So go ahead and participate in that, and we're going to swing back to Andy to help us think about some of these questions.
Yeah, well, thank you both, Ken and Shayla, for your comments. I have a couple thoughts. Kind of working backwards through your topics, Shayla. I think it's important to not collapse lament into sorrow. Lament in the Psalms is this incredibly multifaceted practice that for one thing is not just about grief and sorrow, but also about anger. So on the one hand, it extends the negativity beyond just, I'm sad that I lost this, to where the where are you, oh God? At the same time as it also extends into very radical recommitments of the speaker to God. So in some ways, the most comprehensive Psalm of Lament is Psalm 22. And we have really good reason to think that when Jesus says from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's not taking that line out of context. That's not the only description of his experience. He's actually, because the Hebrews then and now don't refer to the Psalms by their numbers, they refer to them by their first line. So he's actually invoking the entire Psalm to sum up his kind of approach to this moment of utter devastation and dereliction. And Psalm 22, although it begins with this cry and includes words of great fierceness about what's happening and honesty about what's happening, also includes these words of assurance. Yet it was you who took me out of my mother's womb. You have been with me since I was born. And then ends with hope, right? I will and kind of intention. I will proclaim your name in the great congregation. I mean, it's kind of crazy. And I mean, in its original context, who could understand Psalm 22? It's just crazy that halfway through the Psalm, as the speaker is being assaulted by the wild boars of Bashan, he suddenly then says, yet from the horns of the wild oxen, you have rescued. So lament, I sometimes worry that we think that lament in our organizations is mostly about, okay, let's all get together and be negative. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way. There are times to mourn and weep, right? And our team has done that. I've done that. But the fullness of lament actually involves promise, recommitment, statements of trust in God. Yet you are still God. And I think that that's what people really need to be shepherded in. I hope that's helpful as a way maybe
Very
of,
helpful.
in some ways, bringing the lament and celebration a little closer together. And I also, I hope it's not indulgent to say that morning after I woke up in the middle of the night and said to my wife, it's 1914, not 1918, I went back to sleep for a while and I got up at 6 a.m., my normal kind of waking time. And I went downstairs and I realized what was coming to some extent, and not least just for me personally. And I wept like I think I can truly say, like I've not ever wept in my life for a good half an hour. And then I pulled myself together, as it were, and started writing this piece that became Leading Beyond the Blizzard. And that the Spirit was working somehow in that. I mean, I don't want to claim more than one should, but there was this Spirit-guided process for the next week that led to the publication of that on Friday, starting with this weeping on Monday to the publication on Friday of maybe one of the most important things I've ever had the privilege of writing in my lifetime. And that generativity would not, I am positive, would not have emerged from my heart, mind, soul strength without the weeping. So lament is not opposed to creativity. Lament actually unlocks creativity because it's actually, I think, related to what you said, Ken, that when you lament by naming it, you're no longer tamping it down. You're no longer avoiding it. It's becoming fully part of your story and your story with God. And God picks that up and turns it into something beautiful.
It makes me wonder what the time span is in Psalm 22.
Yes.
Because it could be part of a lifetime, even though we read it so quickly, or it could be elastic and could be a condensed, in a sense, almost a liturgy of that lifetime, or part of the lifetime. So there's no easiness to it in that sense.
Yeah, it's become my life psalm. Like if I can only keep one psalm, I want that one because it just has the fullness of what is to live in Christ. Just very briefly on Shayla's two other points, I don't know enough about early 20th century history to really answer your question. What did the church do or not do well? So I will say Alan Jacobs has written quite a remarkable book called The Year of Our Lord, 1943, that is about 5 or 6 Christian thinkers, Jacques Maritain, Simon Weil, W.H. Auden, I forget all of them right now, who all were wrestling with really the questions we're talking about. And it's a sobering book because it's in a way about the road not taken, because really the world that they imagined could be after the conclusion of the Second World War was not the road the institutional leaders of the church chose to pursue, nor that the leaders of the Western world politically chose to pursue. But it's a really helpful book as a kind of historical analogy for our time. And as far as K-shaped personal lives, oh my goodness, yes. And I'm not sure, I think we can both we might think, oh, you're talking about like the sheep and the goats, the people who've done really well and the ones who have flailed, but it's actually all of us are both, right? I think that's what you meant. That's been true for me. I had this manic period, quasi-manic period, very generative period of 3 or 4 months of work starting in March of 2020. And then I hit the summer and I hit the deepest depression and least effectiveness in work of my life. I had to take a day off every week from Praxis, and I gave back my salary because I just knew I was not contributing. I was really paralyzed. And so I think lots of us have been through both and in the and will continue to feel that.
Terry actually has the initial poll results, so maybe we can share those.
Wow.
And oh my goodness.
Hmm.
People who have died in our congregation this year, loss of role definition, loss of community, missing of communion. Much of our church is on the upward angle of K. We deeply lament the disjointedness and social isolation.
Wow, that's so good.
Faltering leadership that does not acknowledge the changes.
Wow.
Not being able to worship together, normal relationships. People otherwise supported by our partners in Africa, Americas, and Asia.
That's good.
Abrupt stop to the things we are doing. And will we return? No return to pre-COVID, lamenting having to change personal contact, lost personal connection amongst staff and friends, fellowship, anniversaries, Easter, Christmas, caroling, meals, loss of co-workers, being together. These are amazing. Thank you very much.
Yeah, very real.
Ken, I had a sense you had a response to something that Andy said, or should we actually, no?
No, just taking it in, so yeah.
Well, please jump in whenever you would like. I think we are building a storm of questions here from participants.
And some beautiful comments in the chat. Thank you all for those of you who are contributing there.
Maybe I can, do you want me to start with the Q&A, Steve? Is that, because we've had a question there from Dave Manifold for a while. He's asking, how can we really know or discern if this moment is more like 1918 or 1940, or was there already a rumbling in the world for conflict? Basically, can you elaborate on your 1914 thought?
I mean, I don't want to overplay it as a metaphor in a way. I think that what I intend by that comparison is reframing the challenges ahead from ones narrowly related to the disease to the institutional undermining and rebuilding that's going to happen and be required. So the Spanish flu itself, millions of people lost their lives, and that was very significant. But on its own, epidemics come and go in human history, and some of them really are quite V-shaped. That is, they're terrible for a year or two, and then they pass. We see this even with one of our recurring kind of challenges in our world today, Ebola, which shows up in a country to date, mostly in different African countries, and you have to mobilize a massive response. But then, you recover. There are interventions that are available, and then nothing has changed kind of really dramatically in the political status quo ante. Politically thinking very broadly, the polis, the way we live together. I think my own view is that that's not going to be the case for this, and it is actually exactly because of the rumblings that were there for all to see. I mean, just to name two very big, large-scale political things, we'd had Brexit and the election of Donald Trump in two different significant Anglosphere countries in 2016. And that should have been a sign to all of us that something was being shaken. And so the reason to rethink in terms of 1914 is first, don't forget that seemingly small things can have really large knock-on consequences, and that seemingly tractable things, because it's just amazing how optimistic the great powers were in 1914. They thought, oh yeah, we'll send our troops out and then we'll be done. And they had no idea what they were about to do to each other. So just scaling up our preparedness for how much could be challenged and have to be rebuilt, I think is really what I'm trying to steel us for, perhaps, as leaders.
Mm-hmm. There is this question from Alex McLeod, which any one of the three of you might be interested in answering. What is the relationship between lament and repentance?
Ooh. Well, I definitely want to hear Ken on this one.
Well, just really simply, repentance doesn't necessarily mean just, groveling in our muck and dirt and vomit and everything. It's not necessarily spiraling into a deep hole. Repentance is really turning to God. That's repentance is the Greek repentano is about a turn of heart, turn of mind toward God. And, whether it's turning from our sin toward God or turning in our grief and anger and questions and rage toward God, both are turning to God. And so in that sense, are linked. They're Godward movements. They're more than just regret. So,
wow, that's good. That's good. I mean, sometimes the lament, I really like reframing that as the turning, whatever it's from, even if it's not from sin per se, it's the turning. And sometimes lament is from the perspective of the one who says, my hands have been clean. I've done no wrong to my neighbor to cause my neighbor to treat me this way, or my enemy, my neighbor has become my enemy. So it's not always the case that suffering causes us to recognize sin, though often I think it does. But yeah, that there is always a turning back required. That's really good. I will say I think related to this, these events reveal how many of us have a prosperity gospel. The prosperity gospel being the inverse of a life of repentance. The prosperity gospel says, be a good person, basically, and good things will happen. God will look favorably on you. And I've felt for years that in the West, most of us function with a prosperity gospel. And prosperity gospel, I've been very influenced by Osama, I can't remember his full name. Osama Giyadu is his family name, from Ghana, who's studied the prosperity gospel in Africa. And he says the prosperity gospel is actually a backfilling of theology to account for prosperity. It's the theology of the middle classes of Africa who find themselves much more prosperous than their grandparents were and need a theological account of why. And it's because you were such a good Christian, of course. And it's very easy for us with more privilege and with less recent histories of deprivation and attainment than is the case of the middle classes of a country like Ghana. It's very easy for us to sort of look askance and look down our noses at that form of the prosperity gospel. But all of us who have benefited from the material attainments of the West have an implicit sense, well, the reason things have gone well for me is I'm a pretty good person and God's pretty happy. And COVID-19 has just blown that apart because we did nothing, but the virus came. And in fact, it was never the case that my charmed life that I enjoyed for a certain time was the result of doing good or God's pleasure or displeasure. It's something way more complex. And in that way, I think there is a repentance in lament that is the repenting of the imagination, the sort of naive imagination that the good do well. And coming to realize in the mystery of God, the broken are rescued. Is the story of God, not the good do well.
So Andy, you've uncorked another bottle here, which I think may oblige you to come back and do another 2-hour webinar, the whole prosperity gospel question.
Yeah.
Because this also applies to organizations, right? Whether it's churches or NGOs, and this assumption that if we're growing, God must be with us, and if we're shrinking, it's bad news and we've done something wrong.
Exactly.
And what moment is more, dramatic around the question of death and degrowth of organizations than this one? So getting our theology recentered in that sense, I wonder if you have a thought on how we actually rethink our relationship as faith-based organizations to the question of cultural, social, and even financial prosperity and growth.
Well,
is that
maybe
for the
we have
next
to do another
webinar?
seminar, because I have to think my way through it before I have anything to offer, except I do think the Western preoccupation with scale, it has only indirect and partial connections to the celebration in the Acts of the Apostles, for example, of growth, the growth of the kingdom. And because it's tricky, because Jesus, says the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed. It starts out very small, but it grows to be this huge, he says, tree. I mean, I've never seen a mustard tree. It's sort of a hyperbole that Jesus employs to say it's going to get way bigger than you can imagine. So growth is not bad for sure, but it's also not the thing. And and we've been seduced by certain kinds of efficiency and scale that comes from efficiency to think that's effectiveness. And I think they're not quite the same thing.
I'm going to encourage folks to go to the second Slido and answer the question, what does your organization need to celebrate? And we'll take a look at that in a moment when you've had a few moments to do that. I want to jump back to, we got questions coming in both in the chat and the Q&A. And I think we left Tim Day way back. And he had a question. He says, I'm interested if you could comment on which structures of society will be significantly restructured and which parts of the Christian church will face significant restructuring, significant shifts versus the snapback to normalcy. You made that really powerful alignment with Christendom,
right,
from 1914 to 1918. I think this is partly the question of, are we going through another version of that in this year and the next couple?
Well, so don't ask me for predictions, because I don't know for sure. And I'm sure, the future really is unimaginable. I mean, the most important things about the future, we truly, truly cannot predict. We can predict the unimportant things much better than the important things. So the deep question here is of very important things that I don't know that we know. If I had to venture a guess, I think I'd maybe restrict myself to answering on the question of the church. There's this distinction in Catholic kind of ecclesial thought and missional thought. It's a bit of jargon, but I don't know of a better pair of words between the modality and the sodality. The modality being the large, sort of easily maintained normal operation of the ecclesia, of the church. This is the cathedral. It's even the parish church. It's kind of everybody can come. We know how it works. It has very well-oiled systems. And then there's the sodality, which is the mission order within the Catholic Church, the Franciscans who appear, the Dominicans who appear, these kind of renewal movements that have very high expectations of their members, rather than sort of everybody join us. It's actually quite difficult to get in. They have very particular charisms that they form people for, another Catholic word, of course. If I had to guess, the things that are going to be really shaken are the modality-like structures of our own form of, I don't know if I'd call it Christendom, but our own Christian institutions. That is, the ones that have been able to just scale up quickly, attract lots of people, have lots of money available, deploy that money in very strategic ways. I would be more concerned that they will really be shaken than the sodality, which is the small group that is genuinely making disciples, the church, even if it's large in numbers, that knows how to divide people up into these circles of 5. I just think the big stuff is more threatened by our current reality than the small stuff.
And if I can just pipe in here, just responding to what Andy said, I'm, as David mentioned, on the board of World Vision, and in the World Vision community, we're talking about 0% business as usual, 100% mission as usual. So the modalities change, the sodality hopefully doesn't.
Yes.
And we are a multi-site church, 5 sites, but we're not meeting anywhere right now in terms of large groups, of course, here in Vancouver. And we've had to go small, but we've probably had, like a lot of people on this call, more phone calls, more Zoom calls, more helping neighbors with grocery runs than ever before. So hopefully we're on mission, but it's not business as usual. So.
Yeah, that's really good. That's right. I was on the phone a couple of days ago with a pastor at one of the most prominent mega churches in the U.S., and he said we are having to think of ourselves entirely as a church plant. There is nothing that we were doing in 2019 that we've been able to continue. And even though we still have thousands and thousands of people affiliated with us, it's a church plant. And so you find out really quickly, do we have the kind of muscle memory of how to actually call people to the kind of rigorous sacrificial life that is present at the beginning of anything. Anything is started by sacrifice. But the modality is the business as usual. But modality is, oh yeah, we know how to run this. We know how to keep this ship sailing. And we don't have many of those ocean liners right now. Shayla, I would be, if I could put you on the spot,
David, you're on mute.
I think of Alpha as one of the most amazing things that's happened in Christian mission and evangelism in my lifetime. And I do also think of it as something that has found ways to really scale quickly and, very impressive growth, wonderful growth. How do you feel about the way I'm framing this? And I don't mean it at all as a criticism of Alpha or any other such organization, but how does it resonate or not with what you see as the opportunities and challenges?
Well, I would say that interestingly, we're just starting to look at the results of 2020 from all of our course surveys, et cetera. And what we're seeing is smaller, right? But interestingly enough, a deeper connection to each other and a deeper new commitment to Jesus. So when we ask the kind of questions around, have you re-experienced Jesus? Have you recommitted to Jesus? Have you made a commitment to Jesus for the first time? That has gone up.
Wow.
And I think it's happening in smaller, intimate groups. Now, these are just the Canadian stats that I've literally just seen. But we moved everything online. And I mean, I start my own Alpha tonight and I'm like, shoot, we're 10 people. We're too big. We should have been 5. But we are rethinking about what does it look like for small groups online? How many screens can you see at once? One is more than enough, but how many little square boxes? But Alpha Online's taken off. And I think I've said that it's become very local and very global. So local being, it's about my neighbors and it's about my literal neighbors, but global. So my Alpha is university friends that live all across Canada that I've never been able to invite to Alpha because they don't live near me. Wow. And so now all of a sudden, my community that I've had friendships for 25 years can actually join me on Alpha. So we've seen this really local, really global. We've seen the shrinking of the size of Alphas. We've had more Alphas running, fewer churches running them. So all along the way, there's been a lot of changes. And the way that I describe it for us is we're just always leading from our toes. Like we're on our tippy toes, moving forward. Like we are on the balls of our feet. We are not on our heels because we have to adjust to what's happening in the world and particularly with the church whom we serve.
Wow. That's so interesting. I had thought as I was thinking about the move from 312.120 to 3.5.12, that one thing that I'm not sure I can prove this, but I actually think the way technology has been available to us in this pandemic, unlike any previous one, actually means that smaller circle still can have global effect. You don't actually have to give up certain kinds of large scale effect.
Yeah.
It's just done with a smaller unit.
That's right.
But thanks to the technology that we have, that small unit is able to do a lot of things that we might have imagined in the past required armies of people. Now 12 can get a lot done. So that's, I think, one real possibility in this time.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask Shayla and Ken in a minute if you had the power to Canadianize Andy, what's the one thing?
Please do Canadianize. Literally, if you can give me an in to naturalized citizenship, I'm all.
Well, yeah, Andy, I remember you saying that you wrote an important article about Trump, and I think you came to Canada and you said you had some clear headspace. So we'd love to have you.
Sorry, David, I totally interrupted you.
Well, I'm going to ask Ken and Shayla in a minute to think about one thing that especially comes out of our dialogue today that needs some kind of contextualization in Canada. And Canada in itself is obviously too large of a context to do that in, because we're neighborhoods. We're Vancouver and Tuktoyaktuk, and we're, Toronto, etc. So if you have a thought on that in a moment, I'd love to hear it. But Terry tells me that we can share a few results from the poll on what is your organization celebrating, or what does it need to celebrate? You've actually created a word cloud. What do you see there, folks, that strikes you?
Love the celebration of people.
Yeah, that's right. That's good.
New church. Creativity.
Mm-hmm.
Does Zoom go together with mission? I'm not sure what that means. Zoom?
I don't know if it's just an artifact of English grammar, but the fact that the word being ends up notable, there's a lot to that. This has been an opportunity for us, for some more being to happen than doing. Doing has been reduced, being has still been possible. That's interesting.
Yeah. I think celebration is so pivotal. If there's one thing I've really learned from many mentors, it's how to celebrate. I think it's something I'm the most passionate about as a Christian.
Wow.
How do we celebrate? And so at Alpha Canada, we've pushed into this, but I do this even with my friends. I found ways to do it during the pandemic that have been, as you said, Andy, small, but so many of the words in that creative way that Terry has taken, everyone's sharing, have just resonated with me. That celebration, I think people have thought celebration has to be large, celebration has to feel like a party. And that's just not true. That's one form of celebration, but there's even the celebration of what does it mean to handwrite a letter or a card to celebrate a long-term friendship that's been meaningful. What does it mean to celebrate the small wins in a friendship? What does it mean to celebrate what you've organizationally done that may not be numerically large, but was a celebration of a team coming to, I love celebration. I'm a celebratory girl. So, I may not be strong on the lament like the two of you, but celebration is my game.
So good.
Yeah, but I'm passionate.
So how would you Canadianize Andy, or some piece of what he's engaging today?
Ken, how would you?
Yeah, our histories obviously are different as nations, and we didn't break from the crown. We tend to be more dependent on government, more compliant to the orders of the health minister, Bonnie Henry, here in BC, or looking to Justin Trudeau's government. And I think we've got a great social safety net, in many ways, a good Medicare system. But I remember early on in the pandemic, I participated in a webinar with Stanley McChrystal, one of your great former generals, and he just said something really simple. This is the time for leaders to lead. And Canadians sometimes are biased against the word leadership. We want to sort of lie low. And so I think this is a time to step up and lead. to serve the best interests of those we are leading, servant leadership, Christ-centered. It's a privilege, it's an opportunity, and people are tired. Tom Rainer, the church watcher in the United States, did a survey, and he said that in America, 70% of pastors are so fatigued and so discouraged that they want to throw in the towel and quit. We did a similar survey here in BC with our denomination, and the sample size was smaller, but the numbers were lining up in a very similar way. And yes, a lot of us are tired and fatigued, but it's also a time to seek the energy of Christ, the filling of the Spirit, and to serve as we're led. So yeah, take heart and lead. And I think we can learn from Andy and our American sisters and brothers in that way. So.
I'll just say, Andy, that I think so many of them were principles that apply to us. I'd say some of the difference that I would see in Canada, particularly in our cities, is that we really have celebrated and embraced immigration in Canada for quite some time. Yes. But, you know, Toronto is the most diverse city in the world. Right. And so when you look at our cities across the country, it would be very interesting to learn from our immigrant population what resiliency looks like, because they're bringing a different history to our country where in many cases, they've had to learn resiliency in a different way. So I do wonder what the church in Canada has to learn from their actual parishioners who have had to be resilient in other forms. So I wonder how much of that will actually influence the church's recovery in Canada as we let those people new to our country show us what they're bringing from other places that could help us. So I don't think there are huge differences from what you shared to how we would have to Canadianize it. But I do think some of the learnings, I think we as Canadians often look south. There are great learnings to learn from people like you and others in the church in the US. But I do think we have to learn to look to other cultural norms in the world. And I think Canadians have those people in our churches. We don't just have to call our friend over in Kenya or in Singapore and say, how are you being resilient? What are you learning? I think we can look into our communities and say, how can we learn from you and your history that could apply to us? That's how I would be thinking resiliency is cultural. And because I'm on a global executive and talking to people in Malaysia and other parts of Asia and Latin America, it's a very different context on what this season means. We're all going through it, but you know, what's happening in Malaysia is not what's happening in the US, and it's not what is happening in Sweden. So where are the pockets that we have to learn the differentiators and not just assume we're all in the same thing? So I'd just make some comments around resiliency and learning from our brothers and sisters who have had to learn the hard way.
That is so good. Early in the pandemic, as I was kind of wrestling with all that was being lost, including some wonderful but very privileged things that I wasn't going to be able to enjoy. I have family members who are classical musicians, for example, who haven't been able to perform for a year now. I was sharing them actually with a very good friend who lives in Canada, but grew up in Papua New Guinea and then lived in Africa for many years and is as African as he is anything else. And he very gently said, he was not all dismissive of what I was wrestling with, but he said, most of the world has lived with this kind of level of disruption and challenge long before COVID came along. And he said, and Christians in the other parts of the world know how to do this. And it was a very helpful, bracing reminder, not belittling what I was feeling and what I was losing, but that there are resources that our brothers and sisters around the world and who have made these perilous journeys to our countries and to your country, they know something about how to make it. That's so good.
There's a great question here from Phil Reinders. Monastic orders and the rule of life communities often emerged and formed in response to these moments of church and cultural transition and crisis. Do you see, and this is for anybody, do you see these forms of ecclesial life taking on renewed significance at this time?
100% yes. At Praxis, we have organized our community around what we call a rule of life for redemptive entrepreneurs. It's addressed specifically to those who have the vocation of entrepreneurship, and every vocation brings with it specific temptations and spiritual challenges, and therefore you need certain disciplines, right? And we, the partners of Praxis, which is 6 of us who lead the organization, all are committed to this, but we just offered it to the rest of the community. We had no idea how many people would take it up. We have been amazed at the hunger for a rule of life, which is obviously taken directly from the monastic model. And I think people are, I think, yes, the most innovative communities will be those that have quasi-monastic structures of accountability, of discipline, of vision for their lives, of the costs they're willing to pay for that. And there's actually a great, great desire among many people to be part of such a community.
And then, Phil knows this, who asked the question, Phil Reinders. Hey, Phil. The word rule actually means trellis, as some of you would know, and there is a real hunger to have a trellis, if we are the vine, to support our life with God right now. So, in February, I'm giving a number of presentations on Zoom on the rule of life, the trellis that supports our life with God in these times of crisis. So we're more exposed to the sunlight of Christ, more pruned, simplified.
Yes.
So, I think it's a practice whose time has come.
Yeah. Yep.
Ken, somebody's also thanking you for their sermon for Ash Wednesday. This is...
I don't have one yet, so if one of you can send it to me. In fact, I think we're gathering around the table, so there won't be like a sermon proper, just to...
Okay.
David, I'd love to ask Andy a question about leading in this season. So many on this call are leading. I think everybody's actually leading on this call. How do we build durable hope? Durable hope, because so many people, like, they came into 2021 thinking, oh, it's going to change this year. And as January unfolded, we realized not so
different, really.
And so I think lots of people who were kind of like, let me get to the new year, I could see it. So many people were then crashing in January, not just because it's deep winter up here in Canada, but because it wasn't a durable hope. It was a hope based on it will change. How can you could you please speak to durable hope for us?
Wow. Well, it is such an important question. And I think I would want to be very transparent and say, I have felt pushed to the limit of my hope. I mean, there is much to be really, really alarmed by, especially in the US right now, especially as Christians, especially as evangelical Christians, which it's not where I came from, but it's the people I identify with theologically. And we are in a kind of peril and crisis that is really, really troubling and has made it hard for me to hope. So I don't want to speak as if this is not an existential issue for me. But what I have grasped onto in the midst of the challenge myself of holding on to a real hope, I think we have to go further back and further forward. And so biblical hope is anchored in the mighty acts of God of salvation. Many of the laments turn at some point to God's mighty acts on behalf of his people when they were utterly oppressed and enslaved in Egypt. God did not forget them, even though it took hundreds of years before God stepped in. They were not ever out of God's notice. He had not forgotten his promises. So like the fact that God has acted to deliver Israel from Egypt and to raise Jesus from the dead, this is why we hope. There is no other reason. We do not hope because we extrapolate trends. We do not hope because we have certain gifts that we're able to bring. The reason we have hope is God delivered Israel from Egypt and delivered Jesus from the grave. And also, Jesus will come again. And he has told us he will come again. And we have so much evidence in our own lives that his words bear fruit and are true and truthful and trustworthy. So we can trust him when he says, I'm going to return. And so rather than having hope in the circumstances, in sort of what got us to here, like, well, I've been doing these things that worked for me so far, so I hope they'll work again, which I think is a very narrow history to draw on. or even our organization. Well, we've been successful for maybe 3 or 4 generations of leadership now, for 100 years, maybe, if you're a really well-established church or something. Well, that's too shallow. That's sand. That's not rock. And the future, we cannot know, but we know God's going to be good. So I think that's one thing. It's rehearsing the mighty acts of God and praying, Maranatha, come Lord Jesus. And then I think the other thing that, I don't know how it fits with that, what I hope in is love. I am loved, not just by God, but by some other people. And we've been through the cycle of rupture and repair that every relationship needs to be real. And we still love each other, and we are not giving up on each other. And we will be separated by death, as I will be from my wife. It's not just my wife, it's other key people in my life. But love is stronger than death. And when one of us dies, the other will hold. Say that I predecease my friends Carl and Elizabeth, for example, 2 of my best friends in the world. Suppose I die tomorrow. Until the end of their lives, encoded in their neurons of their brains and their shared experience as 2 human beings who mysteriously share reality, I will be loved. And that will be beyond my own life while my body is decaying and waiting for the resurrection. And I want to live with that kind of love in my life as a priority in my life. And if I do, I can stand anything that the world can throw at me. And by the grace of God, and it's only through repentance, rupture, and repair that I can get there. I have a few people who I know love me that much and who I love that much.
Wonderful.
I'm going to point out that we have, I think, probably almost half of the questions and comments use the word lament, or at least a third of them. And we have like a dozen unanswered questions and many comments we haven't gotten to. But my quick summary is that there's the lament of the person, there's Christian lament, and there's questions about how we do that well, and whether we're even skilled enough to know what it is. Never mind, perhaps not even being skilled enough to celebrate, because we don't always occupy well those 2 poles. But there's also questions that ask, how do you actually lament as leaders and as organizations? My interpretation of that question related to lament is that organizations are performative places. And they're professional, whether they're churches or NGOs or community-based organizations. And leaders are playing a role, not in a negative sense, but they're pushed to a particular role performatively. And lament requires something more of a leader than Christian lament, which is sometimes seen as me and God shouting at each other on the mountaintop.
Right.
Christian lament as a leader in an organization. I'm wondering if we can talk a bit about that.
That's so good. So, I mean, I have a few thoughts. I have a feeling Ken and Shayla have more important thoughts. It is the case, at least I'm not sure all of what's in your question, David, because there's a lot, but we do have to have our own private practice of bearing the suffering that is ours to bear that doesn't impinge on our public leadership. So I had that half hour of weeping that I described to you, and it's appropriate for me in this context to describe it to you. But it would not be leadership if I were to spend half an hour with these 100+ people on Zoom weeping. It wouldn't help you. You would want to help me, and that would be very kind of you, but it wouldn't serve you. And so part of my work as a leader is actually to have done the private work of lament and with friends who are outside my context of leadership, so that when I'm here with you, I'm able to hold what's real for you and make room for you to feel what you need to feel and express. So that would be one distinction between the kind of private, the work of grief and suffering, and what I call in one of my books, hidden vulnerability, that is the very essence of leadership in a way, so that when I'm leading, I am able to act with a kind of authority that makes, but not an authority that crowds out your distress, but that actually makes room for your distress. As for the professional part, I don't know. I think this is one of the gifts of the pandemic is, I'm in my basement. My kids are grown, so they're not going to come running in, but the professionalism has been disrupted by this experience we've all been through, not in all bad ways, because I don't remember it being said of Jesus of Nazareth what a consummate professional he was. Like he goes to Lazarus's tomb and he does weep there, and he lives this sort of in the midst of things life. And I don't remember Francis of Assisi being, noted for his professionalism. The current Francis, who occupies the seat of Peter, is not especially known for his professionalism. It's not really a Christian virtue, right? So while we, of course, want appropriate boundaries that respect people, which is part of what the disciplines of professionalism can be, I think letting in the fullness of what people are experiencing actually unlocks human capacity. And our little team, which is everything from a 22-year-old who just graduated from university to a couple of us in our 50s and everyone in between, and all sorts and conditions in certain respects, we got to know each other in ways we never would have imagined. We were already quite a open kind of small community of fellow workers, but we just let in the reality of our lives in ways that we wouldn't have done without the pandemic, all to the good of the professional performance of our team, who have performed exceptionally well by any measure, along with space for just open-ended perplexity and distress and loss to be articulated as appropriate as people were comfortable in our meetings at certain points. I hope that's helpful.
Perhaps I can just add to that in terms of the lament question. One of the things that can foster lament is entering into a space of silence. And so, sometimes I'll use the analogy of being out in the water. So, Shayla and I live not far from the ocean here in Vancouver. And I'm out in the water sometimes on a kayak or maybe on a friend's sailboat. And I'll see salmon jumping out at a 45-degree angle, maybe on a rare moment, a pod of dolphins or whales in the distance. And there are times when I'm in silence and this sense that I'm being upheld by the beautiful mystery envelops me. But other times I'm out in the water, I'll see oil on the surface of the water or a styrofoam cup bobbing up and down, an empty Coke bottle. And in silence, I can feel anxiety, envy, anger, whatever it is. And so silence enables us to experience what's going on deep inside us. It surfaces and we can lift that up to God, including lament. And out of that space, I think we can lead our people in lament. So David, I didn't check the email till this morning, just before the webinar, asked me if I'd lead a brief time of meditation. Basically, I did an abbreviated version of what I did in my private practice earlier. And so if we're practicing silence, in touch with what we're deeply feeling, our own lament, I think we can lead our people in that as well.
Wow.
And if I'll just briefly add that Daryl Johnson, who's a friend of both Ken and I, who is a professor from Regent College and a local pastor here at the historic First Baptist Church, he gave our staff sort of a worksheet called Attending to Your Soul. And he said, work it through in this order. And he suggested to me personally, Shayla, do this 4 times before the end of the year. And I did it. And you articulate your fears, your disappointments and losses, your anger, then your tears, both good and bad, your joys, your longing and your desires, and then ask the voice of the Lord and the Holy Spirit, speak to me through your word. And then so I did this 4 times and I know a number of our staff did it. And he just said, it's a way to close out the year and make sure that you're, as you said, attending to your soul, thinking through, and there's many different ways of doing this. We found this really practical, that he presented it to our staff and said, here's a way to work it through, to finish off your year. And in fact, I keep it near me all the time. That's why I could look down and find it right away, is because it's just been so important. And some days I do it because that day I've had to walk through all of those and then get to the place of, come Holy Spirit, through your word or through speaking to me, can you please help me?
Wow. So good.
That Daryl Johnson, Ken, he's a good one.
Yeah, he's amazing. So Thanks, Daryl, if you're watching. So yeah, it's been a
I
great
actually
friend.
appreciate in both of those models, I think an important principle for leadership, which is, David, you used the word at one point that organizations are performative. And I think it's really important that we not compel a certain kind of experience of our people, whether negative or positive. And so the best leadership makes room for whatever people are experiencing or want to express without kind of demanding a certain kind of experience, let alone a certain kind of expression. And I like the way that silence and that sort of inventory makes room without sort of compelling, today's our lament day, come on, let's get our lament on. It's just making room. If that's what is happening in your soul today, there's room for it in this organization. That's a healthy thing, I think.
I suppose in some ways I'm just very aware in my years working with organizations that there's been a distinct trend towards professionalization. And so the grants we get, we have to be very careful about due diligence and accountability and counting things. We do the same thing with performance reviews. We do the same thing with measuring our own organizational indicators related to success. We often use a corporate model for nonprofit leaders and church leaders in order to assess their performance. And so there's a tension, it seems, between that, in a sense, corporatization of the nonprofit world and the roles we hire for, which are very professional and very beautifully talented people with their skills, etc., but always higher and higher. And this call to figure out what resilience actually looks like in our organizations at moments like this, and how we actually open up, because lament requires, as a leader, if it's got integrity, it requires a very deep act of the soul, it would seem.
Right.
And so, and I'm just seeing just some reflections of that in some of the questions.
That's very.
I think I'm going to try to tackle one more, and then we're just about to the top of the hour. Maybe we can have a green room. There was a question from Peter Timmerman. I think Peter's asking, do you have any practical examples of foundational and pre-existing flaws and cracks in our faith-based institutions that have been revealed in this pandemic, i.e. in the sense that something that broke due to COVID may have been broken already? I know we've touched on this a bit in a couple of ways, but
Oh, we just
you
lost
have
him.
some things I need to think about.
Sorry, we lost you for just a moment, David, but
okay.
I think you're back.
Did you hear the question?
Yes, have we had, yes, I think we did, yeah. Two things come to mind for me. One is in the realm of, well, they're both in the realm of church and faith-based organizations, I guess. My own view is that, at least in the US, we do not actually know how to make disciples. We know how to make attendees, to some extent how to make converts, but the making of disciples, people who, George MacDonald has this wonderful, challenging line in one of his essays. Have you today done something only because Jesus commands you to do it? Or have you not done something because Jesus commands you not to do it? And if you have not done either of those, if you've just lived your life, are you really following Jesus? Is there nothing that you've done today only because it's the way of Jesus? And honestly, we have a lot of people who have lived their lives at all stations, all classes, all races, have lived in the groove of culture and felt that they were also Christian. And we have not formed them to cut across the groove. And we're finding out, I think. Another different kind of thing is obviously, obviously in the sense that it's become so evident that our majority culture institutions, against, I'll just speak of the US context, have been so unwilling and slow to acknowledge the history of racialized violence and domination, which goes under the heading of white supremacy in this country. And in some extent, the history of Europeanized world, European world. And those fractures were there all along. But again, this is where 1914, not 1918, right? The pandemic maybe has not sort of acutely raised those issues, though there are really troubling things about disparities in health outcomes and so forth. But the larger social forces unleashed by everything we've been through have just made it clear we were not ready to reckon with who we were and who we failed to be. And that now is causing great destabilizing of trust and confidence in these institutions.
Well, two powerful issues. Shayla or Ken? What cracks or stresses did we have pre-pandemic that have been exposed in our Christian institutions by the pandemic?
I would say briefly around formation, but the next generation's formation. I think we're paying the price for 30 years of youth work that hasn't been successful. Not that there hasn't been lots of wonderful youth leaders out there, but when you look at what's happening in the US and certainly what's happened in Canada, the pandemic is showing those cracks around youth work in particular. And whether we've entertained kids and then lost them, or whether we've discipled and formed young people. And so I'd say that's an area that we've seen the cracks. I think academic institutions, not just Christian academic institutions, which have a particular way of educating young people, whether that's in school, like high schools, or whether it's universities and looking into masters and doctorates. I think those institutions are being challenged in the way they educate and the way they form their own thinking students. So I think education, and particularly around the next gen, are the two areas that I've seen the most change, that outside of the church obviously showing its cracks. And watching, actually, I'll just say in a Canadian context, Andy, you might find this interesting. In some parts of the Catholic Church in Canada, it's really imploding, but there's other places where new life is forming. And in my mind, and from a national perspective, I think the sleeping giant in Canada has woken up, and it's a beautiful, beautiful thing to watch.
Wow.
And David, I think part of what the pandemic has done is it's revealed our true state. Andy, I know that you're also a friend of Kurt Thompson's, the psychiatrist near DC, and he said that the pandemic is not so much creating anxiety, but revealing our anxiety. And so if we haven't been tethered to Christ, that's going to show here in this time. And so in a way, it's terrifying, but it's an opportunity for us individually, but also as communities to re-abide or to reconnect to Christ. And so, it's an invitation.
Wow.
And some of us in the college and seminary world are being challenged by a recent book from Willie James Jennings at Yale, which is called After Whiteness. It's really about after the whiteness of the seminary in the European and North American context. And a lot of us are looking at that as a potential dialogue that will help us to, reinvent our institutions away from some of these fatal flaws. Folks, this has been a remarkable couple of hours. And we're so grateful for your investment in our time together, Shayla and Ken and Andy. For folks that are amazingly, 100 of you are still online. I don't know how you've done it.
Please go for a walk now or something.
Maybe we're all time to head out in the snow and get refreshed.
A ski, perhaps.
This will be available to everybody who has participated as a recording. So you can look forward to receiving that in your email. And I just want to express my gratitude again to the organizations that have made this possible and have funded this event, and look forward to more of this amazing sort of dialogue and more of your public theology, Andy. It's been a gift. Thank you very much.